Welcome to our modern crime scope, where we bring you gripping real-life-inspired stories, chilling mysteries, and dark secrets uncovered. Each video dives deep into shocking cases, told in a suspenseful yet easy-to-follow style, keeping you hooked from start to finish. If you're fascinated by crime, mystery, and hidden truths, you're in the right place. Richard Hale was the kind of neighbor no one noticed, quiet, polite, and seemingly ordinary, until muffled screams from his basement shattered Brookdale's peace and revealed a nightmare hidden in plain sight. The small town of Brookdale had always been known for its quiet streets and safe atmosphere, a place where neighbors trusted one another and everyone believed they knew the lives of those around them. Families often left their windows open at night, comforted by the idea that nothing sinister could ever disturb their peace. Yet beneath this sense of security, something far more chilling had begun to stir, something no one could have predicted. On a crisp October evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the town settled into its usual silence, a sound carried through the air that would shatter this illusion forever. The noise was faint at first, so soft that it could have easily been mistaken for the wind or the restless cry of a distant animal. But the longer it lingered, the clearer it became. It was not the sound of nature at all, but a muffled scream, strangled and desperate, as if someone was fighting against being silenced. Those who lived nearby froze when they heard it. Some dismissed it quickly, convincing themselves it was nothing worth worrying about. A sound produced by the shifting pipes of an old house, or perhaps the echoes of a late-night television. But others could not shake the feeling of unease. The screams, though faint, seemed to rise and fall in waves, carrying with them an undeniable sense of human suffering. They were coming from the edge of the neighborhood, from a house many knew only in passing, the house belonging to Richard Hale. Richard was a man most described as ordinary, though perhaps too ordinary. Middle-aged and solitary, he kept to himself and rarely joined in with the community. He was polite but distant, someone who nodded in acknowledgement at neighbors but never lingered for conversation. His house always looked impeccable, the yard neatly trimmed and the blinds pulled tight across the windows. To outsiders, this suggested a man who valued privacy, someone who enjoyed his solitude. Few had ever been inside, and fewer still could claim to know him beyond a surface level. That secrecy, once unremarkable, now felt sinister in the shadow of the screams that echoed from his home. The sound continued for a few minutes, tapering off as though it had been forcibly stifled. A heavy silence followed, pressing against the walls of the surrounding houses. Those awake felt their skin prickle, torn between curiosity and fear. Was it really someone in danger, or was it their imagination amplifying something harmless? The uncertainty gnawed at them, but most chose to ignore it, clinging to the hope that there was nothing truly wrong. Still, unease rippled through the block. Finally, a decision was made by one resident who could not push away the fear. A call was placed to the local police station, brief and hesitant, reporting strange noises and the possibility of someone in distress. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol car to check it out. It was a simple act, one that felt small at the time, but it would become the first step in unraveling a nightmare. No one yet knew that the screams breaking the night were not only real but also a warning, a clue to something unspeakable hidden just beyond the basement walls of Richard Hale's home. The patrol car rolled quietly through the dimly lit streets of Brookdale, its headlights sweeping across rows of silent houses. The neighborhood seemed almost too calm, a picture of suburban peace that clashed sharply with the reason the officers had been called out that night. When they pulled up in front of Richard Hale's residence, nothing about the house seemed out of the ordinary. The lawn was tidy, the porch light was off, and the curtains remained firmly shut. Yet as the officers stepped out of their vehicle, they could not shake the unsettling weight in the air, as though the house itself held its breath. They approached the front door and knocked firmly, the sound echoing against the stillness of the night. For several seconds there was no answer, only the faint creak of movement inside, footsteps that hesitated as if debating whether to come closer. Then at last, the door opened. Richard Hale stood in the frame, his face partially shadowed by the dim light from within. He offered a stiff, forced smile, his clothes slightly wrinkled, his eyes heavy-lidded as though he had just been roused from sleep. To the officers, however, there was something unconvincing about his calm demeanor, something practiced rather than genuine. They explained the situation, the reports of strange noises, possibly screams, coming from his home. Richard chuckled softly, waving a hand dismissively, claiming that he had been watching an old horror film and had simply forgotten how loud he left the volume. His explanation was delivered smoothly, but the officers could not ignore the faint odor drifting from the open doorway. It was sharp and chemical, the unmistakable scent of bleach clinging to the air, as if the house had been freshly scrubbed. Richard leaned casually against the frame, his body positioned in a way that subtly blocked their view of the interior. One of the officers asked if they could come inside to make sure everything was all right. Richard's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before returning, though thinner this time. He shook his head, insisting there was no need, that he had work early in the morning and was hoping to get some rest. His voice was polite, but the edge of irritation beneath it was difficult to ignore. The officers exchanged glances, both aware that something was off. Yet without a warrant or clear evidence of wrongdoing, their options were limited. They could not force their way inside based on suspicions alone. Reluctantly, they began to step back, their instincts screaming at them that something was wrong but their authority holding them in check. Richard gave them a courteous nod as he began to close the door, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. As the officers made their way down the porch steps, a sound pricked their ears. It was faint, almost lost to the whisper of the wind, but distinct enough to freeze them in place. From the side of the house, near the vents that lined the basement, came a low, muffled noise. It was broken, ragged, and chillingly human. The officers stiffened, exchanging another glance heavy with unspoken realization. They knew what they had just heard, but without proof, all they could do was file it away in their report. For now, the house stood silent once more, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it would soon grow into a storm that no amount of bleach could wash away. The following morning, the unease from the night before still clung to the two officers who had responded to the call. They replayed the encounter in their minds, the too smooth explanations, the smell of bleach that had hung in the air, and most of all the sound, faint but undeniable, that had drifted from the basement vent. It was enough to justify taking action, and by mid-afternoon, a warrant was secured to search the property. What began as a simple noise complaint was about to spiral into something no one in Brookdale could have imagined. When the police returned, Richard Hale's house looked just as ordinary as it always had. The blinds remained tightly drawn, the lawn perfectly trimmed, the air unnaturally still. A team of officers approached with quiet determination, their steps deliberate, their eyes fixed on the house that had already unsettled them once before. Richard was not home when they arrived, and this worked in their favor. They moved swiftly, forcing the front door open and stepping inside with their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The house, at first glance, seemed strangely sterile. The living room was spotless, the furniture neatly arranged with an almost obsessive precision. There were no signs of struggle, no mess that would suggest anything unusual. The kitchen gleamed, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner, and the bedroom was immaculately organized, every object placed just so. It was unsettling in its perfection, as though someone had gone to great lengths to remove every trace of human life. Yet the officers could not shake the memory of the muffled cry, the sound that had made their skin crawl. It had come from below. They made their way to the basement door at the back of the hallway. The wooden frame was worn, but the door itself had been fitted with a set of heavy locks, odd for a simple basement entrance. Using their tools, they worked quickly to break through. The door gave way with a sharp crack, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The air that drifted up was damp, tinged with something metallic and sour beneath the chemical sting of bleach. Each step creaked as they descended, their beams of light sweeping across the basement walls. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Shelves lined with canned goods and tools cluttered one corner, and an old sofa sat abandoned in another. But then, their flashlights fell upon something different. A second door. This one metallic and reinforced, fitted with bolts that seemed far too heavy-duty for any innocent purpose. Forcing it open took time, but when it finally swung wide, the officers were hit with a scene that made their stomachs turn. The walls of the hidden room were padded, covered in thick soundproofing material. The floor bore dark stains, some old and some fresh, telling a silent story of what had taken place there. Chains and restraints were bolted into the concrete, their metal edges worn from use. In the corner of the room, huddled and trembling, was a young woman. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She recoiled at the sudden burst of light but quickly realized that rescue had come. The muffled cries from the night before had not been imagined. They had been her voice, breaking through the walls of her prison. The room was secured, and the woman was brought out swiftly, though she could barely walk on her own. The officers exchanged grim looks as the weight of the discovery settled in. Richard Hale had not simply been a man of privacy. He had been harboring a secret far darker than anyone could have guessed. What had begun as a noise complaint had just unveiled the first horrifying piece of a much larger nightmare. News of the discovery spread through Brookdale with alarming speed, leaving the quiet town reeling in disbelief. Neighbors who had once waved politely at Richard Hale, or seen him mowing his lawn, now struggled to reconcile that image with the grim reality uncovered in his basement. The rescued woman, though shaken and weak, was able to give investigators just enough detail to confirm what many feared. She had not been his first victim. Her ordeal had lasted for weeks, and during that time she had caught fleeting glimpses of evidence that others had been trapped before her. Her survival was a matter of chance, her screams on that October night reaching far enough to catch someone's attention. Without them, she might have simply disappeared like those before her. Detectives began piecing together Richard's life, pulling apart the mask he had so carefully constructed. On the surface, he was unremarkable, an unmarried handyman in his late 40s, known for his punctual work and quiet demeanor. But as they dug deeper, troubling details began to emerge. Richard's work allowed him access to homes and buildings where he often worked alone. His clients recalled how he lingered longer than necessary, sometimes asking strange questions about whether people lived alone or when neighbors were home. At the time, these interactions seemed harmless, but now they painted a chilling picture of a man constantly scouting for vulnerabilities. The basement itself became the centerpiece of the investigation. Forensic teams combed through every inch of the hidden room, collecting fragments of evidence that told a story Richard had worked hard to erase. Personal items were found tucked behind shelves, earrings, scraps of fabric, and even a small shoe, objects that clearly did not belong to him. DNA testing would later confirm multiple victims, some of whom matched unresolved missing person cases from nearby towns. Each discovery widened the scope of the horror, revealing that Richard's crimes stretched back years. Neighbors recalled details that seemed insignificant before, but now felt ominous. They remembered the odd hours Richard kept, often leaving his house at night and returning before dawn. They remembered how he avoided social gatherings, how he always seemed to watch others more than he spoke. Some even mentioned hearing strange sounds from his property in the past, but dismissing them as imagination. The realization that warning signs had been overlooked weighed heavily on the community, fueling both guilt and fear. The rescued woman's testimony provided a glimpse into Richard's methodical cruelty. She described the soundproofed walls, the locks that kept her in darkness, and the constant sense of hopelessness he instilled. Richard had controlled every aspect of her captivity, from when she ate to when she slept, leaving her with no sense of time or reality. It was a calculated system of domination, and her survival hinged on her ability to hold on to the hope that someone might notice her absence. Investigators concluded that Richard's carefully constructed image of normalcy was his most powerful weapon. His clean home, polite nods, and predictable routines had allowed him to exist undetected, hiding monstrosity in plain sight. For years, no one had questioned him, and that anonymity had enabled his cycle of abduction and control. The horrifying truth was that Brookdale had been living beside a predator disguised as an ordinary man. With each new piece of evidence, the community's sense of safety crumbled, replaced by the haunting realization that evil had thrived unnoticed in their midst. The courtroom was packed when Richard Hale finally faced justice. Every seat filled with townspeople, journalists, and families who had waited years for answers. His arrest had turned Brookdale upside down, and the trial became the event that no one could ignore. The man who once blended into the background was now the center of every whispered conversation, his face splashed across headlines, his secrets dissected piece by piece. To those who had lived beside him, it was almost impossible to believe that the quiet neighbor who waved politely was the same man now accused of some of the most horrifying crimes in the county's history. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence. Photos of the soundproofed basement were shown to the jury, the thick padding on the walls, the restraints fixed to the floor, and the stains that spoke of violence too dreadful to imagine. Forensic reports detailed the DNA matches that linked Richard to multiple missing persons cases, some of which had gone cold for years. Families of the victims sat in silent agony as belongings recovered from the basement. Watches, necklaces, fragments of clothing were presented as proof of what had happened within those locked walls. Each item told a story of a life interrupted, a voice silenced. The most powerful testimony came from the woman who had survived. Fragile but determined, she recounted her time in captivity with a steadiness that gripped the courtroom. She described the endless nights in the padded room, the fear that grew heavier with each passing day, and the despair she felt when no one came to rescue her. Her voice broke only when she spoke of the moment she realized someone outside had heard her muffled screams, the moment she realized she still had a chance to live. Her words were more damning than any photograph, exposing the true depth of Richard's cruelty. Throughout the trial, Richard remained unnervingly calm. He sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him, showing no outward sign of remorse or fear. His expression was unreadable, as though he had detached himself from the events unfolding around him. To many, this composure was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. It was the same mask of normalcy he had worn for years, the same mask that had allowed him to walk freely among his neighbors while hiding the horrors in his basement. The jury did not deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony unforgettable, and the verdict was unanimous. Richard Hale was found guilty on multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again walk the streets of Brookdale. For the families of the victims, it was a measure of justice, though nothing could truly erase the pain of their loss. In the aftermath, Brookdale was forever changed. The town that had once prided itself on being safe and quiet now carried the weight of what had happened in its shadows. Neighbors locked their doors at night, suspicious of the silence that once comforted them. Parents held their children closer, and people who had lived side by side for years found themselves questioning how well they truly knew one another. The muffled screams that had first pierced the night had not only saved a life but also exposed a darkness that thrived behind a mask of normalcy. It was a chilling reminder that evil can hide anywhere, even in the house next door.